For the first time in years, after facing one of the worst crises in its history, Boeing may be on the verge of turning the tables on Airbus. And it's not because of the 737 MAX, it's not because of the 777X, it's because of a methodology Boeing itself used decades ago and then simply abandoned. While Boeing was dominating the market with the 737, the 747, and the 767, Airbus was quietly building something different. Not a better airplane, but an advantage that no technical specification can capture and that became, over time, one of the most valuable assets in modern commercial aviation. Boeing saw it happening. It even used this concept before Airbus did. And for reasons that remain poorly explained to this day, it simply left it behind. 40 years later, something is changing, and Airbus executives are paying attention. When you ask an airline executive why he chose Airbus, the answer rarely starts with because the A350 is better than the 787 or because the A320neo beats the MAX. It starts like this: we already have trained pilots. That phrase, seemingly simple, is the center of gravity of Airbus's entire commercial strategy for the past 40 years. Let me explain what it means in practice. When an airline hires a pilot, that pilot goes through a process called a type rating, a specific certification for each aircraft model. This process involves simulators, ground school, supervised flights, and regulatory exams. It's expensive, it's lengthy, and in the traditional model, it has to be repeated from scratch every time a pilot switches aircraft. Airbus created a different system. It calls it Cockpit commonality, the deliberate standardization of the cockpits across all its fly-by-wire aircraft. The practical result is two concepts worth billions of dollars to any airline. The first is cross-crew qualification, or CCQ. Instead of completing a full new type rating, a process that typically takes several weeks, a pilot certified on the A320 can transition to the A330 through a greatly reduced training course focused primarily on the differences between the two aircraft. Even the transition from the A320 to the A380 benefits from Airbus commonality, requiring substantially less training than a conventional type rating. The second is mixed fleet flying, or MFF. It allows airlines, under approved conditions, to use the same pool of pilots to operate different aircraft types, from a 150-seat narrow-body to a 300-seat wide-body within the same scheduling period, significantly increasing fleet flexibility. Airbus claims that MMF can increase productive flight time per pilot by an average of 5 to 15% per year. For a fleet of 200 aircraft, that's not marginal efficiency, that's an entire line on the income statement. But the real advantage is something else. The real advantage is what happens when an airline already operates Airbus and needs to decide on its next purchase. At that moment, every new Airbus costs less than it appears because the pilots are already halfway trained. And every Boeing costs more than its list price because the entire training infrastructure would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Airbus doesn't just sell airplanes, it sells operational continuity. But none of this happened by accident. It was being planned nearly 40 years ago when Airbus introduced the A320 into service, the first commercial passenger aircraft with a fly-by-wire system, where pilot inputs are transmitted electronically to the flight computers rather than mechanically to the control surfaces. The A320 was revolutionary for many reasons, but what John Pearson, then CEO of Airbus, did next is what truly changed the industry. He decided that all of Airbus's fly-by-wire aircraft would have deliberately standardized cockpits, same displays, same operating philosophy, same lateral side stick instead of a central yoke, same flap callouts, flaps 1, 2, 3, full, regardless of the size of the aircraft. Even the position of the side stick when the pilot adjusts the seat is identical across the entire family. When the A330 arrived in 1994, a pilot trained on the A320 looked at that wide-body cockpit and recognized everything. When the A340 arrived, the cockpit was the same, and when the A380 was certified in 2006, an A320 pilot could transition to the world's largest aircraft in less time than it would take to learn to operate an equivalent Boeing from scratch. Airbus created a universal cockpit language, and whoever learned that language stayed locked into it, not by obligation, but by economics. Airlines like Air France, Lufthansa, Turkish Airlines, EasyJet, and Indigo gradually built predominantly Airbus fleets. Ryanair is the perfect counterexample. Europe's largest low-cost carrier operates exclusively 737s and built its own lock-in. But Ryanair chose that consciously for a specific business model. For airlines that need fleet flexibility, from narrow bodies to wide bodies, from domestic to long-haul routes, Airbus offered what Boeing simply didn't have, and that was a silent disaster for Boeing that nobody noticed. Here is where the story becomes unsettling, because Boeing didn't ignore this concept, quite the opposite. In the late 1970s, Boeing developed two aircraft simultaneously, the 757, a narrow-body successor to the 727, and the 767, a mid-range wide-body. The two projects were developed in parallel, sharing cockpit design, avionics, and flight management systems. In 1982 and 1983, both aircraft entered service, and for the first and only time in aviation history, a narrow-body and a wide-body received the same common type rating from the FAA. A pilot certified on the 757 could fly the 767 with minimal differences. Airlines like United and Delta operated both aircraft with the same crew pool. It was exactly the concept Airbus would later scale across its entire family. Boeing demonstrated the concept before Airbus did, and then stopped. The 777, launched in 1995, was developed with its own cockpit philosophy, closer to the 747's avionics than to the 75 and 767. The 737 Next Generation maintained its own family, but isolated from the wide-bodies. The 747 continued with its own type rating. Each program was optimized individually, as if it existed in a vacuum. Why? Part of the answer lies in Boeing's structure. Each program had its own team, its own market logic, its own customers. The internal culture favored per-product excellence rather than system integration. The 777 needed to be the best wide-body in the world, and it was, but it wasn't designed to create an ecosystem. Part of the answer lies in the acquisitions. The merger with McDonnell Douglas in 1997 brought additional cultures and programs that further fragmented the portfolio. And part of the answer, perhaps the most honest one, is that Boeing didn't believe Airbus's lock-in would work as well as it did. The result, 40 years later, Airbus operates with an integrated ecosystem of 6 fly-by-wire families that communicate with each other. Boeing operates with islands of excellence, individually extraordinary aircraft, but ones that don't speak to each other as a system. The cost of that decision became increasingly visible starting in 2010. While Airbus was expanding its family from the A318 to the A321XLR, from the A330 to the A350, and broadening the reach of CCQ and MFF to cover more fleet combinations, Boeing was going through a decade of operational turbulence. The 737 MAX faced 2 fatal accidents in 2018 and 2019, followed by a recertification process that lasted nearly 2 years. During that period, A320neo orders surged. The 777X, which was supposed to enter service in 2020, is still awaiting final certification. The program has accumulated years of delay. And that vacuum allowed the A350 to consolidate itself in the long-range wide-body segment, with a fleet depth that is becoming increasingly difficult to challenge. But that is changing. There is something happening in the most recent programs by Boeing that deserves attention. The Dreamliner, certified in 2011, brought a cockpit fundamentally different from anything Boeing had built before. large format displays, integrated digital architecture, an information philosophy closer to the next generation than to Boeing's previous programs. And then came the 777X. In February 2026, Boeing received initial qualification from the FAA and EASA for the 777-9 training simulators, the first member of the 777X family. And Boeing's official statement about that aircraft's cockpit contains a phrase that would have seemed impossible to imagine 10 years ago.
The 777-9 cockpit was designed to achieve a high level of comfort and commonality with the 777 and the Dreamliner. Although the 777 and 787 retain separate type ratings, EASA has acknowledged a level of operational commonality that allows reduced transition training in approved scenarios, reflecting how functionally similar the two flight decks have become. The standard is beginning to exist. The 787 and the 777X are not just two aircraft with similar cockpits. If Boeing continues in this direction, they are the beginning of a family, the embryo of an ecosystem that the company abandoned in the late 80s and early 90s, and now appears to be trying to rebuild. Boeing understood what it lost, and if it extends this approach to other models, it could redefine the competition between the two manufacturers over the coming decades. But it would be simplistic to stop here, because Airbus, despite all its historical advantage, faces a challenge today that didn't exist 20 years ago. Maintaining commonality is becoming increasingly difficult. The A220 is the most obvious example. Originally developed by Bombardier as the C-Series, the aircraft was incorporated into the Airbus family in 2018, but it carries its own type rating, separate from the entire A320 family. For an airline operating both A220s and A320neos, there is no CCQ between them. They are two separate worlds within the same brand. The A350 brought new displays, new systems, a new cockpit architecture. Airbus maintained its commonality philosophy, and the CCQ between the A330 and A350 works well, reducing training by around 60% compared to a full type rating, but the systems are becoming more complex, and maintaining standardization requires growing effort. Airbus is still ahead, but the advantage is no longer as insurmountable as it was in 2005 or 2010. And that matters, because the next procurement cycle, the one that will determine how global fleets are configured in the 2030s and 2040s, has not yet been decided. If Boeing launches a successor to the 757, the aircraft the industry informally calls the NMA, New Mid-Size Airplane, or that some refer to as the 797, and if that aircraft adopts the same cockpit architecture of the 787 and the 777X, something unprecedented will have happened. For the first time since the early 80s, Boeing will have an integrated family from the outset, a mid-range narrow-body, a long-range wide-body, and an ultra-long-range wide-body, all operating with the same cockpit philosophy, creating the conditions for CCQ and MFF to become part of the Boeing ecosystem in the same way they have been part of the Airbus ecosystem for decades. That doesn't guarantee Boeing will win. Airbus has 40 years of head start and hundreds of airlines with fleets and pilots already integrated into its system, but it changes the question. For decades, the question was, which airplane is better? And that question always had complex answers, variable, context-dependent. The new question, the question that will define the next 30 years of this industry, is different. Which manufacturer will build the ecosystem that is hardest to leave? That answer is still being written.